I don't know if you believe this, but this passage was one of the very first for me as a young youth pastor that began to shape my pastoral imagination, my sense of what it means to be called a pastor. And so that was 16 years ago. You can find this passage all over my journals. And then as I was getting ready to graduate from seminary, this was the passage that I chose to preach for my senior sermon. And so it has a special place in my heart, which you might be like, what? Why? Well, let's explore it. And let's start by exploring something else that has been important to me through the years. A long time ago, people would give me a hard time for lots of reasons, but one specifically, when they found out that I was a Raider fan. I would often get questions about how can a Christian even be a Raider fan in the first place? People would mock me over how long it had been since the Raiders were relevant, good, or had won anything. People used to give me a hard time. But it's weird, like they don't anymore. It's not because people could suddenly understand why a Raider fan or Christian could be a Raider fan, but it's, I think, Ben, that the Raiders have been bad for so long, I just actually think people genuinely pity me. My team, like, mocks me enough on their own, just with their consistent commitment to mediocrity. And so I just think people who like me don't feel like they need to rub it in anymore, right? There's no need to beat a dead horse. I used to tell people that being a Raider fan made me a better Christian when people would ask me, how could a Christian be a Raider fan? And I would say things like, listen, it has trained me in the kind of long suffering that is necessary to follow Jesus. I would say things like, I am learning to be faithful no matter what my team does to let me down or abandon me. Back then, I couldn't have imagined just how much being a Raider fan would help me grow in my faith or understand my faith. For example, our passage this morning. I understand this morning's passage in what feels like a deep way because of the Raiders. Our passage this morning is about change. Specifically, our passage is about how a group of people change or don't change, right? Lots of books have been written over the last 30 years about how slowly groups or organizations change, if they change at all. And as a leader of this group called by God to change in particular ways, right, I've picked up these books through the years, and they all mostly say the same kinds of things. That change is hard, organizations are slow to change if they ever can do it. But being a Raider fan has taken the knowledge of these books, and it's helped me feel this truth in my bones, right? In a way that I couldn't if I had just read about it. Because I became a Raider fan in 1994. So it's been 30 years. And for those 30 years, the team has had the exact same motto: commitment to excellence. Right? And for most of the last 30 years, the Raiders have been committed to just about everything and anything else. And here's the crazy thing. In those 30 years, this team has had different starting quarterbacks and different captains and different coaches and different general managers and even a different owner. The same guy doesn't even own it anymore. It's his son. And yet, the Raiders consistently right, lead the league in penalties. The Raiders' locker room is almost always like majorly dysfunctional, and the Raiders just are always in a rebuilding mode. You could point to moments of excellence over the last 30 years, but again and again, the team, it just reverts back to mediocrity, making the same mistakes over and over. Each new coach steps in and has a new plan. Each new coach makes new and big promises, but then 4 weeks into the season, you're busy trying to trade your best receiver. I'm not bitter. Real change is hard, especially changing something like the culture of a team, the culture of a community, the culture of a nation. Our passage this morning spans 25 years. Jehoshaphat was king of Judah for 25 years. Jehoshaphat. Say that name with me. Say Jehoshaphat. Okay, yeah. Jehoshaphat. When he started to reign, chapter 17, we read that his heart was courageous in the ways of Yahweh. And furthermore, he took the high places and the Asherim out of Judah. But 25 years later, we find the high places, however, were not taken away. I'll say a little bit more about these high places in just a minute. But for a second, just consider this. Jehoshaphat starts his reign as king by getting rid of all of the high places. 25 years later, they are back. And this is an issue, a serious issue, because in the books of Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, the core instruction from God given through Moses, they make it clear high places have no place among the people of God. And so I want you to consider like this experience. A number of years ago, I was with an older pastor, and he was a mentor of mine, and he was the pastor who introduced me to one of my favorite authors, Eugene Peterson, and I will be eternally grateful to him for this. This pastor, as we were together, was telling me about the time 20 years earlier when he had the privilege to spend a week at a retreat led by Eugene Peterson. This is a dream. Here we were all these years later. This pastor has pulled out journals, notebooks from that retreat, and he's sharing them with me. And this is like a treasure. There were all of these comments about what he was learning and the kind of pastor that he wanted to be as he got older. And comments about the kind of pastor he didn't want to be, because a huge part of Eugene Peterson's ministry was helping pastors embrace God's call to this work. And as his pastor and I, as we sat together and he read these notes to me, he was sharing what he had written, these insights, I watched this older pastor sink a bit, because he started to realize and name that he wasn't the pastor he had hoped to become, that some of the things that he said he would never do as a pastor, he had done, and some of the things that he had committed to doing, he sort of just never got around to doing. Kids in the room, I have something to say to you just for a second. It's probably true that some of you maybe don't like something about what your parents do in your lives. Chances are good that kids, you don't like something about what your parents do. And I promise you, a day is going to come when you're growing up and you declare when I'm a parent, I will never do that. It's going to happen. But guess what? 25 years, you'll discover that you're doing the exact same things that you said you'd never do. It's really hard to change. And it's really hard to sustain that change over 25 years. But it's actually worse than that in our passage, because Jehoshaphat is Asa's son. And Asa was the king for 39 years. And when Jehoshaphat was 35 years old, that's when he took over for his dad. So, math's not my favorite, but think about it, right? Jehoshaphat was alive for 35 years of his dad's reign. He missed only the first 4 years. So he saw what his dad did. He learned from him how to be king. And here's what Jehoshaphat saw. So if you have your Bibles and you're following along, chapter 14, we get an intro to Asa's reign. We read, Asa did what was good and right in the eyes of Yahweh his God. He took away the foreign altars and the high places and broke down the pillars and cut down the Asherah. That's where it all started for Asa. And then let's see how it finishes. Chapter 15. But the high places were not taken out of Israel. Nevertheless, the heart of Asa was wholly true all of his days. Interesting, right? Like father, like son, same experience. Asa takes away all the high places at the beginning of his reign, and by the end of those 39 years, they're back. Then his son takes the throne, and what's the first thing his son does? Like his dad, he also takes away the high places. And you can imagine Jehoshaphat, like watching through those years, the high places starting to reemerge, creeping back into society over these 35 years. One by one, the high places are rebuilt and reestablished. And can you imagine Jehoshaphat asking Asa about this, saying, Dad, what are you doing? Aren't you going to do something about these high places? I can also imagine Asa tired, just tired. After 39 years of taking high places away, only for them to come back. The title of this morning's sermon, is there anything that will survive in the end? It seems it's high places and cockroaches. They just always seem to come back. Asa ultimately decides, it's just not worth the fight anymore. It's not worth the effort. And so by the end of his 39 years, he gives up. And I can totally picture Jehoshaphat saying what every kid says at some point as they get older: I'll never repeat the mistakes of my dad, right? I'll never get tired of doing what is right. My dad did, but I won't. In the New Testament, like we find this very exhortation: do not grow weary in doing good. A constant call to patient endurance. Jehoshaphat declares he'll never give up. And we see his strategy for creating a lasting change. So in chapter 18, we actually find Jehoshaphat goes about this differently than his dad did. And so we read, in the third year of his reign, Jehoshaphat, he sends officials to teach in the cities of Judah. And with them, he sends the Levites, and with these Levites, some priests. And they taught in Judah, having the book of the law of Yahweh with them. And they went throughout the cities of Judah, and they taught among the people. And so you can see Jehoshaphat's strategy, how he's going to be different than his dad. It's simple. He will send trained teachers to the people, and they will teach the people God's ways, and then they will get the why. Because the law is clear, right? High places have no place among God's people. And so Jehoshaphat's like, okay, well, I'm not going to just take away the high places, because there's something about the high places that are deeply connected to people's hearts. And so if I just take it away, they'll just find ways to bring them back. Instead, he teaches the people why. Why are we doing this? Why is this so important? How does this help us seek God and align our hearts with God? But it's not just sending teachers out. This actually isn't the end of Jehoshaphat's strategy, because if we keep reading, after some years, Jehoshaphat seems concerned that he hasn't done enough. Chapter 19, it seems that he doesn't trust the teachers to really hammer home the message powerfully enough, because in chapter 19, we're told he personally went out among the people. So can you picture this? This is the king, goes out among the people, and he brings the people back to Yahweh, the God of their fathers. This is a beautiful picture of a king who doesn't just sit on his throne and send out his emissaries, but he comes down into communities and he tells the people, he calls the people back to God, and he appoints judges in the land. And so he lives in Jerusalem, so he leaves people there in those places. To really cover his bases, Jehoshaphat then, he selects some Levites, some priests, the heads of families, and they then serve as judges, as people who are to remind people what is true and good and right there in the city of Jerusalem, so that Jerusalem will be an image, a reminder to all of the others of what they ought to do. So here's the picture that Chronicles is painting. Jehoshaphat watched his dad remove the high places, but without an explanation to the people. Asa never seemed to follow up. And so over time, the people defaulted to their familiar, their family traditions that were disconnected from God's intentions. And so they turned back to what they knew, to what was comfortable again and again. But Jehoshaphat learns from his dad, and he develops a strategy to teach and to reteach the people. Not only will he remove the high places, but will understand the why behind it. And then Jehoshaphat, he raises up leaders to help keep the teaching in front of the people and to help keep the people staying true. But as we've read, I already gave away the final punchline, right? We already know. By the end of 25 years, Jehoshaphat's reign comes to an end, and the high places are back. Jehoshaphat has a new and a better and a different strategy than his dad had. But as one leadership guru likes to say, culture eats strategy for breakfast. That the culture of a community is way more powerful than a strategy to change behaviors. And Jehoshaphat's strategy cannot defeat a culture where, and this is the final summary, the people have not yet set their hearts upon the God of their fathers. This is the explanation for the high places coming back. Their hearts belong to the high places. They trust in what happens at the high places. At some point, Jehoshaphat, like his father Asa, just stops removing the high places. And there they are at the end of 25 years ago, or at the end of 25 years. A few years ago, I was with a friend, a young pastor friend, and we were with an older pastor. And the older pastor was asking us about our churches and what we sensed God leading us to do in our congregations. And with passion and excitement, which I'm sure shocks you thinking of me being in any way passionate or excited about anything, we just unloaded on this guy. Oh, all these things, these are the things we're excited about. And one of the things I shared with him is some of the things that our board and our church have been talking about for a number of years, like our vision of being Jesus in every neighborhood throughout the area. And this other pastor friend of mine with me, he shared his heart. And this older pastor, I'll never forget, says, "Ooh, I don't miss your passion. That passion is going to lead you to a ton of disappointment." It'll be interesting to see how passionate the two of you are in 15 years. Jehoshaphat, 15 years in, starting to wonder if change is possible. Both of us walked away from this conversation really just blowing the guy off, right? Like, what does he know? Of course, he knows his experience, and he remembers what it's like to try to change a community over time. But it's interesting because just recently, in the last couple years, the two of us were talking again, and we both found ourselves recognizing a new kind of weariness in each other. And it kind of took us off guard. And part of that comes from a Jehoshaphat-like experience, not the removal of high places as much as just walking with a community through change or trying to. Because, right, with a strategy in place, you've heard me talk for years now about neighborhood groups and trying to help us imagine being Jesus in every neighborhood. And if you think you've heard me talk a lot about this, ask board members who've been on the board over the last 5-6 years. I don't know that I talk about anything else. But I find myself resonating with Jehoshaphat a little bit, where strategy just isn't enough to overcome culture. And there are these two aspects of not necessarily our church culture, but a larger, American church culture that I think fight against our Jesus in every neighborhood strategy every single day. The first is, and consider whether these ring true to you, and let's talk them out. I'm curious if you find that they sit with you as true. But we generally don't believe. When I say generally, it doesn't mean everybody, right? But broadly, we don't believe we need each other daily. That we don't believe we really need other Christians engaged with us in our daily lives. We need to want a daily connection with other followers of Jesus. We need to want this, which means we need to believe that we need it. And some do, some hold this. Maybe their life circumstances have them in a place where they're just very aware, I can't do this alone, and so they are much more drawn to others. But so many of us, as part of our culture, are really self-sufficient, and so we don't really have a sense that we need one another in this deep and daily kind of way. And so our culture says church, right, is an event that you go to once a week, that you like, and it makes you feel good, and it's meaningful. But we need a culture that says church is a community of people that I am connected with daily, because with them I encounter Jesus daily. And I cannot be who God made me to be without them every day. the different core belief about what the church is. Daily connections with each other is the first cultural shift we need to make. And the second aspect of our culture preventing us from moving toward Jesus in every neighborhood is a real commitment to our actual neighborhoods. Most of us treat our neighborhoods like the place where we happen to live. Like we fell there and just ended up there on accident. It's the place where we chose to live for whatever reason, because the schools were good, because it was what we could afford. And so we sort of just have that's where we are. But what would happen? What would happen if we could reimagine our presence in our home and in our neighborhood as an act of God? That God was involved in putting us right where we are. Like, what would change if I believed that God wants me in this neighborhood with these neighbors and these Christians next door? What would happen if I believed God sent me to this neighborhood and has called me to these people and this place for such a time as this? I think we would commit ourselves to our neighborhoods in ways that we can't create or plan a strategy for. These are just some of the ways that today, 12 years after writing a different sermon on this passage, I'm continuing to reflect on what it means for Jehoshaphat to be a good king, but to not remove the high places. All of this brings me back to the work of a king who is out to shape a people. And when we meditate on the Kings and Chronicles, the move is always to the one true king. And so we find ourselves considering Jesus. Jesus. We think about the way that he formed a people, a kingdom of people. He didn't just come along and tear down high places. He didn't just teach the people why he was tearing down the high places. But when I think about his 3 years with the disciples, 3 years of daily connection with the disciples, with work that was rooted in actual places, consistent people and places like neighborhoods, he spent 3 years with his disciples cultivating their hearts. His focus was on changing their hearts. He spent 3 years with his followers creating among them a radically different kind of culture than the cultures surrounding them. He spent 3 years with them, showing them how to walk by the Spirit of God. He spent 3 years not just giving them some new things to do, but transforming them. And yes, you can read Jesus' work and you could identify a strategy to what he's doing. But at the heart of it all was a change of heart. He helped his followers give their hearts fully to his Father. And if our passage tells us anything, it is that when our hearts belong fully to God, when our hearts are fully devoted to God, we'll stop seeking our high places because our true King will be more than enough. And we'll go anywhere Jesus leads us. And so our passage asks the question, do our hearts belong fully to the Lord this morning?